Hi, I'm Barry Press, Artistic Director of Living Literature. 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, granting women the right to vote. What you are about to see is a video edition of a presentation of the piece commissioned by the League of Women Voters of Rhode Island and Westerly Library to celebrate this special anniversary. The material was taken from a variety of sources and is intended to give you a sense of the individual's voices and events of this more than 75-year struggle for the women of the United States to obtain the right to vote. Living Literature is a collective of Rhode Island-based artists and educators who create readers' theater-style presentations to dramatize non-dramatic writing. Now in its 24th year, Living Literature has created over 100 programs based on poems, stories, novels, plays, essays, biographies, articles, and oral histories, giving presentations in schools, libraries, and other community venues throughout southeastern New England. Performing today is Tammy Brown, Laura Hakim, and Kelly Sy. This program is made possible by a grant from the League of Women Voters of Rhode Island Education Fund.
Living Literature celebrates the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
Voting rights have been a contested issue from the very beginning of the American experiment. When the founders wrote, "We the people," they really meant we, the white wealthy men. Despite much lofty rhetoric, all men were not created equal, and women didn't count at all.
The rest of our national history can be seen as a continuing push toward and reaction against expanding the franchise to include those groups of citizens purposely left outside.
Winning the franchise was a crucial milestone in American women's struggle to secure their legal, economic, and societal rights, claiming their place in the modern world. And although these events took place almost a century ago, the story's compelling themes,
Power and political will,
Race and gender equality,
states' rights and voting rights,
and corporate influences in politics,
all remain urgent present-day concerns.
But in order to understand this struggle, it is first necessary to understand what women's place was in the 19th century world.
In the early 19th century, the roles of women in American society were predominantly as cook, wife, mother, and general homemaker in a mainly rural setting. Families were much larger and relied on the women to provide children to perform free manual labor on the farm in order to maintain the family income and welfare. They enjoyed few political, legal, or social rights and were expected to be subservient to their husbands and fathers in all matters.
The doctrine of separate spheres maintained that women were to rule the domestic sphere of the home and raising children, while men operated in the public sphere of business, trade, and government.
Women of African descent who were enslaved usually had no public life. They were considered property and could be sold and raped with impunity by those who, under the law, owned them. Few participated in public life, though some participated in the public sphere as preachers, teachers, and writers.
Some women gained access to higher education, so at first, they could be better teachers of their sons as future public citizens and of their daughters as future educators of another generation. These women were not only teachers, but founders of schools.
1848. The Seneca Falls Convention on July 19th was the first women's rights convention, advertising itself as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the dominant force behind the convention at Seneca Falls, New York, where she made these remarks.
We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in the case of separation, the children of her love, laws which make her the mere dependent on his bounty. It is to protest against such unjust laws as these that we are assembled today.
1850, just 2 years after Seneca Falls, reformers organized the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, to consider the rights, duties, and relations of women. 11 Rhode Islanders, most of them radical abolitionists, participated in the National Women's Rights Convention. Foremost among the Rhode Island organizers was Paulina Wright Davis, who chaired the historic gathering in Worcester, attended by some 1,000 people.
The attendees listened to rousing speeches by Frederick Douglass, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth, who said,
"If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them."
At the convention, Frederick Douglass courageously endorsed Elizabeth Cady Stanton's resolution, saying,
"It is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise."
The Worcester group debated and passed several resolutions advocating for the rights of women, and ended its proceedings by calling for equality before the law for all, without distinction of sex or color. From north to south, the press found these reformers wonderfully ridiculous people. Paulina Wright Davis later recalled,
"The hen convention was served up in every variety of style till refined women dreaded to look into a newspaper."
the convention set up a rudimentary form of organization, a coordinating committee, a plan for women's suffrage petition campaigns in 8 states, and committees to report on women's educational, industrial, legal, and social status.
1851. Sojourner Truth gave her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in May, saying in part,
"Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Well, where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him."
National conventions were held yearly through 1860, just before the Civil War began and women's rights advocacies ground to a halt until the war ended in 1865.
The issue that dominated reform politics after the Civil War in Reconstruction politics was Black suffrage, which had a great influence on the struggle for women's suffrage.
Indeed, without anyone noticing the change, women's rights was replaced by
woman suffrage as the designation of the movement for equality for women.
During Reconstruction, the demand for women's suffrage moved from the state legislatures, where it had been focused in the 1850s, to the U.S. Congress, where post-war debates on Black suffrage were taking place. As Susan B. Anthony explained,
"Up to this hour, we have looked to the state action only for the recognition of our rights. But now, by the results of the war, the whole question of suffrage reverts back to Congress and the U.S. Constitution."
1865. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton petitioned Congress for women's suffrage for the first time, not only because it was more efficient than state-by-state action, but because it seemed more consistent with their claim that women had the same rights, particularly to political power, as men.
1866. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and others formed the American Equal Rights Association, an organization for white and Black women and men dedicated to the goal of universal suffrage.
1867. Elizabeth Butham Chase submitted the first petition for women's suffrage to Rhode Island General Assembly. It would be more than 50 years for women to fully gain the right to vote. But this petition was an important step for women's suffrage in Rhode Island.
To the the General Assembly of the State of Rhode Island, we, the undersigned, women of Rhode Island, would respectfully represent that, being law-abiding citizens of said state, we are denied the elective franchise solely on the account of our sex, that we are taxed without our consent and compelled to obey laws in the making of which we have no voice, that by the theory of our government, taxation without representation is tyranny, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. We, therefore, respectfully petition your honorable body to take such steps as may be necessary to amend the Constitution of this state as to secure the women and the exercise of the elective franchise, and thus make the theory and the practice of the government harmonious.
1868. On July 9th, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted, granting citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and slaves who had been emancipated after the Civil War, including them under the umbrella phrase, all persons born or naturalized in the United States.
It is difficult to convey the public censure and harsh criticism that women activists endured. Anti-slavery and women's rights advocates like Elizabeth Buffum Chase and Paulina Wright Davis were attacked and pelted with eggs and other projectiles, spit on and called vulgar names.
In her speech given at the Women's Suffrage Convention in Washington, D.C., Elizabeth Cady Stanton said the following:
"A man's government is civil, religious, and social disorganization. The male element is a destructive force, stern, selfish, aggrandizing, loving war, violence, conquest, acquisition, breeding in the material and moral world alike discord, disorder, disease, and death. We ask women enfranchisement as the first step toward the recognition of the essential element in our government that can only secure the health, strength, and prosperity of the nation. Whatever is done to lift women to her true position will help to usher in a new day of peace and perfection for the race."
1869. A major split occurred among the suffragist movement over the passage of the 14th Amendment. Political forces beyond their control made it impossible to unite the demands of women and the freed men.
But Stanton and Anthony took the further step of arguing that white women, educated and virtuous, were more deserving of the vote than ex-slaves, and they formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in New York. The primary goal of the organization was to achieve voting rights for women by means of a congressional amendment to the Constitution.
Lucy Stone and others formed the American Women's Suffrage Association in Boston, which focused exclusively on gaining voting rights for women through the individual state constitutions.
In Rhode Island, Elizabeth Buffum Chase sided with Lucy Stone, and in the split of the Rhode Island leadership, Chase took on the presidency of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, saying at one point,
"Although we have not the chain, the lash, and the auction block, in their literal sense, there is enough that is unjust and degrading in the condition of women to convince us that the work to which this generation of reformers is called is of far wider significance to the progress of mankind than was the anti-slavery struggle."
After the passage of the 14th Amendment, it became increasingly clear that the American Equal Rights Association formula for reconciling Black suffrage and women's suffrage was doomed. Feminists either had to defer their demands to Black suffrage or oppose enfranchisement of Black men in the name of women's emancipation.
Frederick Douglass, strongly supported suffrage for women, but believed that white women already enjoyed some amount of electoral privilege through the family, something which all Black people, women and men, were totally cut off from. Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued that one should not go without the other. White women suffragists had been avowed and crucial supporters of emancipation.
Despite the hopeful potential of the forming of interracial organizations, fights escalated over time and became heated between white women suffragists, especially Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Frederick Douglass and Black women suffragists. It was Anthony who asked Douglass not to attend the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention in Atlanta, Georgia. Anthony later explained that Douglass's presence on the stage with the honored guests would have offended the Southern hosts. Anthony's and Stanton's long-standing racist remarks evoked intense anger on the part of some Black women suffragists, especially Sojourner Truth.
There is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if colored men get their rights and not colored women theirs, you see, the colored men will be the masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So I'm for keeping the thing going while things are stirring, because if we wait till it's still, it will take a great while to get it going again.
1870, the 15th Amendment was adopted, granting African American men the right to vote. Now, a politically mobilized African American community joined with white allies in the southern states to elect the Republican Party to power, which brought about radical changes across the South. By late 1870, all the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union, creating a political and legal landscape that was ripe for a challenge to these new voting regulations.
1872. Susan B. Anthony seized the moment. Gathering up her three sisters, the ensemble walked down to their local voting registration store, which also doubled as a barber shop, and asked to be allowed to register in advance of the upcoming election. They fully expected to be denied, and they just planned to use that refusal to mount a legal challenge to their exclusion to the polls.
To their surprise, the three local election inspectors did not immediately turn them away and agreed to enter the women's names on the voting rolls. Taking advantage of this unexpected turn of events, Anthony quickly got the word out that other women should register. That day and the next, approximately 50 women answered the call, setting the stage for the Election Day drama.
Rochester, November 5th, 1872. Dear Mrs. Stanton, well, I have been and gone and done it. Positively voted the Republican ticket. Straight this AM at 7 o'clock, was registered on Friday, and 15 other women followed suit in this ward. Then on Sunday, another some 20 or 30 other women tried to register, but all save 2 were refused. All my 3 sisters voted. I hope this morning's telegram will tell of many women all over the country trying to vote. It is splendid that without any concert of action, so many should have moved here so impromptu. If only now all women's suffrage women would work to this end of enforcing the existing Constitution, supremacy of national law over state law, what strides we might make this winter. But I'm awful tired. For 5 days I have been on the constant run, but to splendid purposes. So all right, I hope you voted too. Affectionately, Susan B. Anthony.
After Susan B. Anthony and 14 other Rochester women committed the crime of casting ballots in their local Rochester wards on Tuesday, November 5th, the legal wheels were set in motion. First, the local U.S. commissioner invited the women to come to his office for an interview. Anthony sent word to him.
I had no social acquaintance with him and didn't wish to call on him. If he wanted to see me on official business, he must come and see me.
2 weeks later, a U.S. Marshal knocked on Anthony's door and, with some embarrassment, admitted that he was there to serve a warrant for her arrest. The Marshal escorted Anthony and 2 of her sisters to the federal offices. However, they were not arrested, and they did not spend time in jail. Anthony was technically under arrest and refused to pay bail. Under more normal circumstances, this might have landed her in jail, but the authorities were unwilling to take her into custody, fearing adverse publicity.
The now momentous act was covered in the New York Times the next day under the heading Minor Topics, and took a dismissive tone, referring to Anthony and those with her that day as a little band of 9 ladies.
1873. In January, a grand jury indicted Anthony, charging her with violating the Enforcement Act of 1870, a federal law designed to cut down the voter fraud in the post-Civil War South. However, the law only applied to federal offices. The next step was a trial before an all-male jury. While awaiting trial, Anthony voted again in March, but since it was a local election, no charges were brought. Finally, the trial got underway in June 1873. The presiding federal judge, Ward Hunt, had recently been appointed by President Ulysses S. Grant to the U.S. Supreme Court. Anthony recalled later,
On the bench sat Judge Hunt, a small-brained, pale-faced, prim-looking man, enveloped in a faultless suit of black broadcloth and a snowy white tie. This was the first criminal case he had been called on to try since his appointment, and with remarkable forethought, he had penned his decision before hearing it.
she was not being sarcastic. That is exactly what happened. After the prosecution and defense had presented their cases, Judge Hunt turned to the jury and began to read from his prepared statement.
Perhaps if the 15th Amendment had included the word sex, the argument might have merit, but in my opinion, the 14th Amendment does not give women the right to vote. Therefore, Anthony is in violation of the law. Upon this evidence, I suppose there is no question for the jury, and that the jury should be directed to find a verdict of guilty.
His instructions clearly violated the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of trial by jury. After some quick legal skirmishes by Anthony's lawyers to no avail, the jurors were discharged without ever having discussed the case or been polled about their opinions. That was Judge Hunt's first mistake. The second was when he said at his sentence hearing,
Has the prisoner anything to say why sentence shall not be pronounced?
Yes, Your Honor, I have many things to say. For in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled under the foot every vital principle of our government. My natural right, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. When I was brought before Your Honor for trial, I hoped for a broad and liberal interpretation of the Constitution and its recent amendments that should declare all United States citizens under its protected aegis. But failing to get this justice, failing even to get a trial by a jury not of my peers, I ask not leniency of your hands, but rather the full rigors of the law.
Judge Hunt finally pronounced his sentence.
Fine of $100 and court costs.
I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty.
And she never did, but she did say,
Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you under the indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. I not only committed no crime, but instead I simply exercised my citizen's right, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution beyond the power of any state to deny. It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizen, nor we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people, who formed this union. We formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. It is downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot.
1890, the National Woman Suffrage Association
and the American Women's Suffrage Association merged to form
the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and began to wage state-by-state campaigns to obtain voting rights for women.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton made these remarks in her address at the founding convention.
For 50 years, we have been plaintiffs at the bar of justice, and 3 generations of statesmen, judges, and reformers have exhausted the able arguments and eloquent appeals in the courts and before the people. But as the bench, the bar, and the jury are all men, we are non-suited every time, and yet some men tell us we must be patient and persuasive, that we must be womanly. My friends, What's man's idea of womanly? It is to have a manner that pleases him, quiet, deferential, submissive, and approaches him as a subject does a master. He wants no self-assertion on our part, no defiance, no vehement arraigning of him as a robber and a criminal. Patience and persuasion are beautiful virtues in dealing with children and feeble-minded adults, but with those who have the gift of reason and understand the principles of justice, it is our duty to compel them to act up to the highest light that is in them and as promptly as possible.
1893, Colorado became the first state to adopt an amendment granting women the right to vote. Anna Howard Shaw was one of the younger women whom Susan B. Anthony befriended and encouraged to become suffrage leaders. Indeed, Shaw eventually became president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She wrote of the work she and Aunt Susan, as many called Anthony, performed in the Western campaign for the cause.
Aunt Susan, then nearly 70, was still as fresh and as full of enthusiasm as a young girl. She had a great deal to say of the cause, always the cause, and what we too must do for it. The previous evening, she had been too busy to eat any dinner, and I greatly doubt whether she had eaten any lunch at noon. She had been on her feet for hours at a time, and she held numerous discussions with other women she wished to inspire to special effort. Yet, after it all, here she was, laying out our campaigns for years ahead, foreseeing everything, forgetting nothing, and sweeping me with her in her flight towards our common goal until I, who am not easily carried off my feet, experienced an almost dizzy sense of exhilaration. That was Aunt Susan. And in the 18 years which followed, I had daily illustrations of her superiority to purely human weakness. Like a true soldier, she would snatch a moment of sleep or a mouthful of food where she found it, and if either was not forthcoming, she did not miss it. To me, she was an unceasing inspiration, the torch that illuminated my life. We went through some difficult years for the cause.
1900. Carrie Chapin Catt took over the National American Women's Suffrage Association, developing the winning plan that focused solely on the issue of suffrage and the passage of a federal amendment. By the first decade of the 20th century, a new generation of university-educated women started careers as municipal reformers, often through the establishment of settlement houses. Chicago's Hull House was the first settlement house in the United States, addressing the needs of a community and providing training for young social workers.
1906, at the convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Jane Addams, the founder of Hull House, rejected the idea that citizenship should derive from men's ability to serve as soldiers. And in a statement to the U.S. House Judiciary Committee on Women's Suffrage a few years later, she said,
Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the committee, in presenting our arguments for your consideration in regard to these amendments to the Constitution, we would like first to draw your attention to the fact that women had suffrage already, to a very large extent in the United States. More than 1 million women will be eligible to vote for President of the United States next November, 1912. More than 500,000 in addition have the municipal franchise. In fact, the remaining women of America are almost the only English-speaking women in the world who are deprived of the municipal franchise. In England, women vote upon all civic matters, and of the women in the English colonies also vote upon municipal affairs. The women in the North, particularly Finland, Sweden, and Norway, have the full franchise, and America's fast falling behind the rest of the world. 100 years ago, we occupied an advanced position in regard to the extension of the franchise. At the present moment, we are quite behind in this belief that every adult is entitled to representation in his own governmental affairs.
1912. By now, 9 Western states had adopted women's suffrage legislation. Anna Howard Shaw campaigned hard in those Western states, saying,
"A gentleman opposed to their enfranchisement once said to me, 'Women have never produced anything of any value to the world.' I told him the chief product of women had been the men, and left it to him to decide whether the product was of any value."
1913. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. Their forces was lobbying for a constitutional amendment to secure the national right to vote for women. 3 years later, they renamed it the National Woman's Party. Alice Paul said,
"Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically. To me, it is shocking that a government of men can look with such extreme contempt on a movement that is asking nothing except such a simple thing as the right to vote. There will never be a new world order until women are a part of it."
1916. By now, all of the major suffrage organizations were united behind the goal of a constitutional amendment. Militant suffragists used tactics such as parades, silent vigils, mass meetings, and hunger strikes, and were often met with fierce resistance. Opponents heckled, jailed, and sometimes physically abused them. New York State adopted women's suffrage in 1917, and the political balance began to shift. But that same year, the United States entered World War I.
The National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, supported the war effort, making the case that women should be rewarded with enfranchisement for their patriotic wartime service. In July, picketers outside the White House were arrested, including Alice Paul. She and others were convicted and incarcerated, and while imprisoned, Alice Paul began a hunger strike and was forced fed.
1918. President Wilson faced a difficult midterm election. 15 states had extended equal voting rights to women, and after much bad press about the treatment of Alice Paul and the imprisoned women, President Wilson announced that women's suffrage was urgently needed as a war measure, changing his position to support a constitutional amendment on January 10, 1918. Coincidentally, the same day the House of Lords gave final passage to women's suffrage in Britain.
1919. On May 21st, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment, originally written by Susan B. Anthony and introduced in Congress back in 1878, was passed by the House of Representatives, and 2 weeks later, the Senate followed.
However, the approval of 36 states of the then 48 was needed to ratify the amendment in order for it to become law. So sure that women could get the right to vote, Carrie Chapman Catt established the League of Women Voters in 1920 to encourage women to use their hard-won right before the amendment was passed. She said,
"To get that word male out of the Constitution cost the women of this country 52 years of pauseless campaign.
56 state referendum campaigns.
480 legislative campaigns to get state suffrage amendments submitted.
47 state constitutional convention campaigns.
277 state party convention campaigns.
30 National Party convention campaigns to get women's suffrage planks in the party platforms.
19 campaigns with 19 successive Congresses to get the federal amendment submitted.
And the final ratification campaign.
It was the United States which first established general suffrage for men upon the two principles that taxation without representation is tyranny, and that governments, to be just, should derive their own consent from the governed. In the United States, however, women are still taxed without representation and still live under a government to which they have given no consent.
Tennessee played a pivotal role in the passage of the 19th Amendment. By the summer of 1919, 35 of the 36 states necessary had ratified the amendment. 8 states had rejected the amendment, and 5 had not voted. The governor called a special session of the Tennessee General Assembly on August 9, 1920, to consider the issue.
Pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage activists from around the state and the country descended to Nashville, intent on influencing the legislature. Suffragists saw Tennessee as their last best hope for ratification before the 1920 presidential election. Among the national suffrage leaders in Nashville that summer was Carrie Chapman Catt, who later wrote,
"We now have 35 and a half states. We are up to our last state. With all the political pressure, it ought to be easy, but the opposition of every sort is here fighting with no scruple, desperately. Women are here appealing to Negro phobia and every other caveman's prejudice. Men, lots of them are here. What do they represent? God only knows. We believe they are buying votes. We are terribly worried, and so is the other side. I've been here a month. It's hot and muggy, nasty, and this battle is desperate. We are low in our minds. Verily, the way of the reformer is hard."
Harry T. Byrne was a Republican member of the Tennessee House of Representatives, and at the age of 22, he became the youngest member of the state legislature. Byrne had originally intended to vote for the amendment. After being pressured by party leaders and receiving misleading telegrams from his constituents telling him his district was overwhelmingly opposed to suffrage, he began to side with the anti-suffragists. However, a letter from his mother helped to change his mind, which he held in his coat pocket during the voting session on August 18, 1920. It said,
"Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Catt with her rats. Is she the one that put rat in ratification? No more for Mama this time. With lots of love, Mama."
After much debating and argument, the result of the vote was 48-48. Byrne followed his mother's advice. His vote broke the tie in favor of ratifying the amendment. He responded to attacks on his integrity and honor by inserting a personal statement into the House Journal.
"I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification."
1920. The 19th Amendment enfranchised 26 million American women in time for the 1920 U.S. presidential election, but the powerful women's voting bloc that many politicians feared failed to fully materialize.
The 19th Amendment failed to fully enfranchise African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, and Native American women. Women finally secured the right to vote nationwide in 1920, but Black women were for decades after that routinely turned away from the ballot box. Only in 1965, with the Voting Rights Act and with subsequent court decisions, were the tools of disenfranchisement that targeted people of color, including poll taxes and literacy tests, outlawed.
A century later, Americans are only just beginning to reckon in earnest with the complexities of the suffrage movement's victory. Many of the white women who are widely remembered as its heroines refused to fight for Black women who risked their lives for the cause. Some of those same white women had fought vocally against the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote in 1870, saying that white women deserved to vote instead.
The centennial of the 19th Amendment's passage is an occasion for celebration, but it's also a cause for inquiry. Americans have again arrived at a political and cultural flashpoint in which women are playing a transformative role. More women than ever ran for Congress and for governor in the last election. More women than ever before are now serving in the House and in the Senate. Recently, there were 6 women running for president, the most for a major party nomination in American history. Previous record was 2.
People continue to fight over what it means for women to have political power and whether they truly have it.
The feminist movement is as fractured as ever, stunted by many of the same forces that complicated the fight for voting rights a century ago.
The pressing question isn't just what all of this means for women, but what it means for everyone.
Women have been allowed to vote for nearly 100 years now. The real work is just beginning.
Thank you for taking time to listen to our program. After our presentations, we like to encourage our audience to give us their views and to share with us their listening experiences. If you are so inclined after this format, you may leave comments on either our web or Facebook pages. My thanks again to Tammy Brown, Lara Hakim, and Kelly Sy. Hope to see you soon in person.